When couples first decide to separate, they have a million things to think about. A million details go through their mind and lots has to be sorted out. A million questions still to be answered. And one of the most important details, often overlooked, yet one of the most important factors in everything that you will deal with regarding your settlement and your negotiations, which are ultimately included in your separation agreement, is your separation date. Is your separation date the date that you and your spouse had the divorce talk and both decided to get a divorce? Is it the date prior to that when one of you started sleeping in another bedroom or in the basement? Is it the date that one of you physically moved out of the matrimonial home? Most people don't know what a separation date is or the importance of it until after they've met with their lawyer or their mediator, and then they have the additional task of having to backtrack and figure it out. Not only will it save you time if you know your separation date when it comes time to meet with your lawyer or your mediator, but if you're thinking about or planning now to divorce your spouse in the future, the sooner you understand how your separation date will factor into your costs and your settlement later on, the better your lawyer can help you pre-plan your divorce strategies and your finances long before you even have that divorce talk with your spouse and decide to separate. The separation date is as important for you to agree on as any other variable, such as custody, visitation, spousal child support, and all the other negotiable details. Not only must a separation date be determined, but it really is in yours and your soon-to-be ex's best interest if you can agree on that separation date. Otherwise, it's just going to cost you a lot more money to fight over that in court and have the court determine it for you. It's important to know because the length of your marriage can have a significant economic impact. Spousal support might be significantly less for shorter marriages than longer marriages. Also keep in mind that the start date of your relationship might also be a factor, since spousal support can run from, meaning be calculated from, the beginning of your relationship together and not just your actual date of marriage, unlike property claims. So if you've lived together prior to getting married, it might be a factor in your costs. So strategically choosing a separation date might work in your favor or be in your best interest. Now, as for property, such as the matrimonial home, likely one of your largest assets, when that asset is divided, it has to be valued. And whether the property is valued by an appraiser because one spouse might be buying out the other spouse, or the value is determined by the sale amount if the home is sold, the value is calculated from the date of marriage until the date of separation, also known as your separation date. The separation date might seem obvious if you lived together as a family, slept in the same room, but weren't getting along for a long time. And let's say one particular day you both sat down, had a talk about your relationship, and you both decided together that the time has come to get a divorce. That might seem obvious. But what if, in your marriage, the relationship between you and your spouse actually ended a long time ago, before anyone switched bedrooms or moved out of the house or had the divorce talk? Did you know that a spouse's claim to the other spouse's matrimonial property can be affected by the length of time since the relationship ended? Meaning, you might want to have a separation date based on when the relationship ended and not many months or possibly years after that when you physically moved out. Did you know that claims against property by a spouse can be prohibited after 6 years of separation? I actually had a client who left her matrimonial home 7 years prior. She was the breadwinner in the marriage. She suspected that her husband had narcissistic personality disorder and she couldn't deal with him anymore. So to avoid conflict, she buried her head in the sand, so to speak, as many people unfortunately do when they don't want to deal with conflict or difficult decisions. And what she did is she bought herself a new home and their daughter chose to live with her. The husband didn't work, couldn't feed or support the daughter, so he agreed and didn't fight my client on the living arrangements with the daughter. But he remained living in the matrimonial home because she didn't want to deal with divorce and couldn't get him to agree to sell it at the time. 7 years later, she was tired of supporting the costs of the matrimonial home that he was living in by himself, along with her new home, so she wanted to sell the home. That's why she called me. They never chose a separation date, never asked a lawyer for advice beforehand, and never filed for divorce or took any action for 7 years. Her rights, or her financial interests, and her share of the sale of the matrimonial home can be affected by the time lapsed since the relationship ended. If the husband learned about this little but very important fact and he fights it in court for his increased portion of the asset. Sometimes it's not so obvious when a relationship actually ended. For example, sometimes couples no longer look and appear as a couple in their public life, but they still live in the same house, and they sometimes live in the same house for years. Has the marriage ended? Sometimes finances prohibit one spouse from physically moving out. We certainly learned that during the time of COVID-19, the pandemic, where people can also be forced to live in the same home for a long time, while technically they might not be deemed to be still in a marital relationship any longer. Since nobody has moved out yet, if somebody were to ask one of them, they might not consider themselves separated technically, or in the literal sense of the word. But emotionally, they could still live under the same roof for many months or years, yet in their own minds feel the marriage has long since been over. They might agree that on a certain date their relationship ended, and so perhaps they can agree on that, although they weren't physically separated. It was that date that they agreed on that shall be considered the separation date, if they agree. If two spouses can't agree on a separation date, then the courts have a list of factors and criteria that they can consider when deciding if and when a marital relationship was really over. What the law will try to define is when it became obvious that there was no reasonable prospect that the couple would resume a marital relationship. Some of the variables that might be considered can include, is the couple any longer intimate? Do they sleep in separate rooms? Have they stopped eating meals together? Have they stopped buying groceries for each other as a family? And in some case, where they do live under the same roof, do they have separate shelves in the fridge or, different cupboards for their own food? Sometimes the variables can go to even further degrees than that by examining things like, do work colleagues think these two people are still a couple? Same for friends and relatives. Do they think they're still a couple? Does the couple still attend social gatherings together? Do they still give each other birthday cards or gifts? Does one spouse still help the other spouse with household chores? How each spouse reports their marital status on their tax returns. Of course, while none of these can prove if a couple still has a marital relationship by themselves, usually a combination of these variables can be taken into account when a couple can't agree themselves on their separation date. So like I've said many times before, every divorce is different. So you really have to speak to a lawyer or a mediator to get the proper guidance on determining or planning your separation date. But I'll sum it up for you like this. If you and your soon-to-be ex had a talk one day and took a few days to think about it, and then both agreed that you couldn't save your marriage, and you told the kids a week after your decision, then it really shouldn't be too difficult for you to agree on a separation date. Because the difference of a few days or a week likely won't make a big difference to you in most cases, not necessarily all, but most cases, so do check with your lawyer. But if one of you has been sleeping in the basement for 2 or 3 months or more, and you both have not been intimate, and you both have been leading separate social lives for several months or longer, then it's important to have a talk with your soon-to-be ex and see if you can agree on an official separation date, which is usually when the relationship ended. Otherwise, if you can't agree, then speak to your lawyer or mediator, and a separation date will have to be determined for you. Now, a word of advice. One mistake, a big mistake, that many people make is believing that they don't have to speak to a lawyer or a divorce professional until after they've split up, or waiting until that time. Remember, knowledge is power, and if you're thinking of or planning to divorce in the future, but haven't told your spouse yet, getting preliminary advice now on how to strategically plan your separation date around your finances can be worth a lot of money that you might save in the future when that time comes. In other words, if you and your soon-to-be ex haven't discussed your separation date yet, let's discuss strategies that work in your best interest before you have that talk. If you have any questions about your divorce or possibly getting a divorce, me and my team of divorce professionals and divorce specialists can answer all of your questions, any aspect of divorce, be it real estate, legal, financial, emotional, parenting, and insurance. And we're all specialists in divorce within each of our respective professions. So don't hesitate to reach out to me. There's never any obligation or pressure. Just email me with any questions that you might have, mike@thedivorceguy.ca. It's strictly confidential. And be sure to check out my friends at divorcespecialistgroup.com. They have the best professionals and the best divorce specialists in town. They have the most stringent vetting process to ensure that. And they also have a really good free download that you can get. It's a divorce checklist, so I really encourage that because there's some great information on there. Please hit the thumbs up now before you forget so that this video can also help others. Thanks for watching.